Professor Mark Hutchinson.
Great. I took seriously the request that this be an education conference. So what you're about to get is part of a very long formal paper with lots of footnotes. So you can ask for the paper later. I won't get through the entire thing, but I will try to land on a suitably Pentecostal warm note. Mene mene tekel upharsin. It is written, but what does it mean? And where are you when it's being written? And who can interpret it for you? These things all matter. And that's the gap between having a vision and actually building one. Have you ever gone for a walk around the block with a child? It's an interesting experience because when you leave the house, you think you're going from A to B, right? You're going to move your body from here to the park, right? And that's what I'm going to do. For a child, on the other hand, it's, oh, look, a dog. Oh, look, a tree. Oh, look, it's red. Oh, wow, clouds. You know, for you, what is a sort of a linear process, for the child is what one author has called an investigatory exercise that begins with energy and ends only when exhausted. And mostly you're the exhausted one. I have 3 grandchildren. I know what this is like. We adults have learned, in other words, to notice less than we are capable of. Children sense the world at a different level of granularity, attending to parts of the visual world that we gloss over, to sounds that we dismiss as irrelevant. We just don't hear it. We don't see it. What is indiscernible to us is really plain to them. And it's a sort of a wonderful multi-dimensional awareness that the 19th century psychologist William James called Aboriginal sensible muchness. I love that term. Aboriginal means original, inbuilt. Sensible, that is about the sensorium, all the things which are available to the senses. Muchness, that's what a child lives in. In other words, we adults, we learn to wrap the world around ourselves and our immediate needs rather than our real abilities and our direct appreciation of the glorious nature of creation. We learn to be boring and to be satisfied that boringness is perfectly normal. That's the definition of being a responsible adult. Unless, like Carl, you're an irresponsible adult, which is another issue. If you hold that image in your mind, you will, as Carl said yesterday, be able to sympathise with teachers because they go into that room every day with 30 of those little fellows. With artists and with cognitive scientists, teachers share a common problem, and that is that the humans with which they deal are limited. The things with which we see also limits our seeing. The art of seeing has to be learned, says one scholar. The village that we all know is required, and I'll get back to that in a moment. Keep village in your head. The village that we all know is required to raise a child is precisely needed just for that reason. Cognitive science Alexander Horowitz has recently read a brilliant little book which is written around, which is called On Looking, 11 Walks with Expert Eyes. In this book, she walks around a city block, which has the spatial aspects, after all, of a village, with 11 different experts, from an artist once, to a geologist, to a dog, and to her own 2-year-old. And then she writes down everything that those people, that each of those people who are with her, or if it's the dog, not a person, but anyway, and she records the differences in the observations that each of them made. Her point is made acutely that one's makeup, passion, focus and training actually dictate what we see, sometimes even when it's not there. Humans learn problem solving through 2 kinds of attention. We see what we attend to, and we learn attention. We see vigilance, right? That is the things which scare us. A lion leaps out of the park, and so we're always very vigilant. Look out for that car. Don't cross the road yet. You know, watch out for that swing. If it gets too high, you'll get knocked out. You know, so parents are vigilant, and then they have this thing called selective attention. That is, you've got a list in your head of the things in the world which are important, and you're attending to those and you're ignoring everything else. Because our ability to see and to attend are limited. Between those 2 points, between vigilance and selective attention, most adults miss just about everything else. So I wonder if that was what Jesus was talking about when he said, "Let the little children come to me, because of such is the kingdom." I wonder if that is what Jesus is referring to when he says, "Your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven," because here are some people who can actually do his will, and followed it with, "Give us this day our daily bread." In other words, there is a sort of special connection in the New Testament between the kingdom of God and the ability of God's people to be present to the kingdom, which is even now coming amongst them. In Matthew 12, there's this lovely but quite confronting passage in which a demon-possessed man who is blind and mute is brought to Jesus, and Jesus heals him so that he could both talk and see. The passage is quite specific in providing, the determination that he has a demon. He doesn't have epilepsy. Right? The text is quite specific. It's specific also about the puzzlement in the crowd who had to consider what this behaviour and the presence of Jesus meant, because suddenly they're in the presence of the spiritual. Now, of course, to us, we can see here, now, with lots of Sunday sermons under our belts and maybe a few Bible courses and a few other things, we can see that it is not just a miracle, that it's actually an act of lordship by Jesus. He's expressing his lordship, Kyrie. All the people who were astonished, it says, and said, "Could this be the son of David?" meaning the prophesied Messiah. But then the Pharisees heard this and they said, "It's only by Beelzebul, the prince of demons, that this fellow drives out demons." Same reality, different observations, different interpretations. The people responded by what leapt up in their hearts. They said, "This is the Messiah," the one that they've been hoping for in their hearts. The intellectual Pharisees, on the other hand, leapt over the desire of the troublemaking people, because people are trouble, and having already identified the thought that they could not think, i.e. that Jesus could be the Messiah, they dismiss that and they arrive at the only other conclusion that if the demons will only obey their master, who is Beelzebub, which is the Aramean word for accuser or enemy or Satan, shaitan. So when Jesus goes on and he says, like a really good teacher, he starts to unpack for them what just went on in their own heads. And this is what good teachers do when you equip people. You think it was about that. So tell me more. What do you really think it was about? And then the teacher will pull that out and then flip it, sort of a form of mental judo, of getting someone to shock them into the realisation of some sort of alternative reality which they hadn't even thought of, or perhaps they'd dismissed. So Jesus schools them on the nature of things. Not only on the nature of things, but on the contributors to the false reasoning that both of those parties had. Jesus knew their thoughts, the text tells us, and said to them, "Every kingdom divided against itself will be ruined, and every city or household divided against itself will not stand. If Satan drives out Satan, he is divided against himself. How then can his kingdom stand? And if I drive out demons by Beelzebul, by whom do your people drive them out? So then they will be your judges," witnesses. "But if it is by the Spirit of God that I drive out demons, then the kingdom of God has come upon you." Great teaching technique. Jesus is an awesome itinerant teacher. He uses people's own starting points to shock them into larger realizations. So, option A, heart logic, Messiah, close but no banana. Option B, reactive Pharisees. Here's a thought that it might be, but we can't have that thought, so let's go for another one. Drives out people by Beelzebul. Well, reactive Pharisees, totally wrong, and judged by your own practice. Anybody for option C? So that's where Jesus ends up in that particular teaching moment. So what is option C? Well, he makes this really explicit. Whoever is not with me is against me, and whoever does not gather with me scatters. So here is why options A and B don't work, and why reasoning, which has no connection to revelation, has no capacity to understand what is actually happening in this moment. Every purely rationalistic answer to this situation will fail. It just doesn't have the tools to do it. The point Jesus is making here is that the deity cannot be defined by categories. The deity cannot be defined by categories. That's just not a Jesus point, by the way. Aristotle said exactly the same thing when he called the creator force in the universe the primum mobile, the unmoved mover. Right? And Plato said it was about pure form, that when you get back beyond the forms, there's the pureness of form, which is itself not defined by form. So it's not just a Jesus thing. You could have understood it if you were willing to understand, even if you weren't a Jew, even if you weren't wrapped up in the Messianic prophecies. So the point, you don't even have to be a Christian, therefore, to understand a lot of this sort of stuff. That's why Paul says there's enough revelation in the world for people to be judged for their own sins. God is always justified in his decisions. So if Jesus is indeed the Son of God, then he is not to be judged, but the one against whom all other categories are judged. Now that's a realization outside the logic of the heart or the logic of the law. This is a mistake of most forms of human inquiry and learning. We apply the normal approaches to learning and we find the gospel too difficult a thing, and so we put it in a box. We begin to cut it down to our size. We begin to talk about it as if it is, like those adults, only in the two categories that we're interested in, that is the things of which we must be vigilant and the things that we must avoid. And then Jesus goes on and he says this very difficult thing which people have written hundreds of millions of words on, I think, and mostly got it wrong. But he says, and so I tell you, every kind of sin and slander can be forgiven, but blasphemy against the Spirit will not be forgiven. Anyone who speaks a word against the Son of Man will be forgiven, but anyone who speaks against the Holy Spirit will not be forgiven, either in this age or in the age to come. So what is the sin against the Holy Spirit which cannot be forgiven? I was very interested in this as a young man because I grew up in a very legalistic tradition and we tried to count all the sins and make sure we didn't do them. But this one took me a lot of years to work out until I gave up the whole legalistic framework. It is to do just what the Pharisees have done. That's the unforgivable sin. It's in the text. It's not hard. Here is a thought about the nature of the world that we will not let ourselves think because it would challenge our conception of who we are. That is the unforgivable sin. There is a place where we will not let the revelation of God take us. We have sealed off the action of God. Why is it unforgivable? Because redemption can only reach as far as forgiveness can reach. So just think about that for a moment and we'll turn to the concept of equipping people for the mission of the church. What are the thoughts you cannot allow yourself to have? I don't mean just any thoughts, but thoughts which relate to calling, preparation, your interpretation of what God can and is doing in the world. The questions which Tanya referred to yesterday, the unthinkable things which saying yes to God entails. So he talks to you and then he just basically, just dead silence on the line, right, after that. But, the talking God, why isn't he talking? Well, that's your bit. Being prepared to ask such questions and to seek the answers is the seed planted which will give birth to a tree of wisdom. You will not be shocked to hear, however, that many of the structures of our lives, including our churches, our societies, our schools, our governments, are built around precisely not asking those questions. Let me provide you with some examples. I'm a historian of the church, right? We glory in things which have been glorious in the church. And then some of us actually then talk about the things which are not so glorious as well. Some of the things which the church has been involved in over the centuries directly relate to the inability to ask the question, what if God in fact might be doing something different? Seems like a good idea to me. Most of history can be written about under that title. It seemed like a good idea at the time. Napoleon invading Russia, for example, seemed like a good idea at the time. Hitler declaring war on the United States. Okay, maybe we wouldn't have gone that way. But what if God might actually be doing something different? If that thought is unthinkable, then we've probably already thought the thought which the Pharisees thought. If one thinks about the huge infrastructure of the Roman Catholic Church, which was birthed out of the primitive church, but then it was recognised and absorbed by Constantine and absorbed as part of the Roman state. So at that time, it seemed like a really good idea because they got all their property back, all their people were released from jail, Constantine threw money at them, there were new translations of the Bible, people started flooding into the churches. A really good idea at the time. I think standing sort of 1,500 years later, we'd maybe ask whether it was such a good idea. And no doubt there are many productive fruits. It is the fact, however, that in the history of missionary movements, more people have been converted by people being pushed out of such imperial relationships than those who have been deliberately evangelized through imperial relationships. If you think, for example, of the vast missionary enterprises which the Spanish Empire, through which they took the name of Jesus all over Latin America, well, it wasn't really until the 20th century when indigenous Catholicism and the rise of the Pentecostal revival helped to indigenize a faith to that vast continent, that the Catholic continent, in fact, became a Christian continent. If we turn to Africa, you can see a very similar thing. The mass conversions of people in West Africa, for example, have largely come about through spirit movements and the indigenizing of the gospel by Africans who were converted often on the coast and who then took the gospel to their own peoples. People like William Wade Harris, for example. The actual number of people converted by missionaries, when you count them up, is actually pretty small, as Andrew Walls, who's Professor of Missions History at the University of Edinburgh, now at Princeton, has demonstrated. In fact, if you take into account the rise of Russian Orthodoxy or the Christianization of the German tribes on the other side of the Roman limes, the Roman border, or of the expansion of Christianity into Persia or India or any other parts of Asia, the same patterns can be seen. Very largely, those indigenous forms of Christianity emerged because people were pushed out of the empire in which the Christian church had become an orthodoxy and then had to, in a sense, indigenize themselves across into a different culture. It was the unorthodox, the ones who chose to ask the other question and who have been prepared to pay the consequences for it, who have been proven to be the most effective evangelists in the history of the church. In short, I'd go and find out, for example, how many people David Livingstone converted. That's your homework. In short, there are many conditions in which the mission of God has been achieved in the world despite the church. At least the church as might be identified by the people at the time and who thought that what they were doing was a pretty good idea. We are reminded of Jesus' statement, whoever is not with me is against me, and whoever does not gather with me scatters. It is not our job, in short, to equip people for our mission. It is our job to equip people for his mission, a mission which we ourselves often only see vaguely and which we need to follow with passion, but it'd be nice to have a bit of understanding at the same time. Some principles of how you can do this can be found in Jesus' words with which he follows his statements about the unforgivable sin and about the demoniac. He says, make a tree good and its fruit will be good. Or make a tree bad and its fruit will be bad, for a tree is recognised by its fruit. You brood of vipers, that's the Pharisees he's talking to. How can you who are evil say anything good? How can you even think of the thing that you can't think of? For the mouth speaks what the heart is full of. A good man brings good things out of the good stored up in him, and an evil man brings out evil things out of the evil stored up in him. But I tell you that everyone will have to give an account one day, everyone, on the day of judgment, for every empty word they have spoken. For by your words you will be acquitted, and by your words you will be condemned. By your words, by our words. That's an interesting take on the day of judgment, if you think about it for a moment. So what is implied by the challenge of equipping people for a mission, the aim of which we can't be sure, the aim of which we can be sure, but the means for which we are always trying to guess a bit, it's always shifting. Well, if we start here in Jesus' description of the good trees, I think you get a reasonably good idea about what equipping is all about. Firstly, the aim is to create good trees, not to determine the fruit before you start. Don't force grow the fruit. Grow good trees. In other words, do what farmers do. Find out where you get good nutrients, what good light, the water, the drainage and the aspect which is suitable to the plant. Proximity to other trees. By the way, trees talk to each other. Did you know that? Anyway. And things which will, in other words, which will propagate good growth and then produce good fruit. Don't try and force the fruit. Secondly, the mouth speaks what the heart is full of, not the other way around. In other words, simply confessing things doesn't necessarily make a good heart. We live in a time when people fear so much how others will react to what we say that we conform to their context. Christians are as guilty of this as any group, particularly those who've been taught that a negative confession is the equivalent of sin. Well, it may well be in some circumstances, but in other settings, sometimes it's just a matter of telling you the truth. And without the ability to tell the truth, you're actually in no position to call yourself an educator. The truth must be the truth in the end, no matter what wrapping you put it in. By the way, where was Chris Twins for most of my life? When a pastor stands up here and handles the Bible and translates on the fly out of Hebrew, I'm thinking, I'm going to move cities and join his church. Yeah. I run my church. Anyway, a good man brings good things out of the good stored up in him. Well, what have we got stored up in us? For many of us, a fear of the world causes a retraction to those things we know. The Bible, a certain kind of teaching, the publications of a certain grouping, because we're sure of that, we're absolutely sure of the podcasts of Tim Keller. I'm not going to listen to anybody else, I'm just going to listen to Tim. But Paul is a bit bolder than that. In Philippians 4, he tells us to fear nothing, but to live in peace. And then think about whatever is true, whatever is noble, whatever is right, whatever is pure, whatever, if anything is excellent or praiseworthy. So what is the range of things on which we should be thinking? Well, whatever. Anything, actually. Not just the things which don't elicit fight or flight from us. Anything as long as it is rooted in the true, the noble, the right, the pure, the lovely, the admirable, the excellent, the praiseworthy aspects of creation, which was in fact made by him who is himself, to quote Plato, truth, nobility, justice, purity, beauty, glory, excellence, and worthiness of praise. He who is not judged by the categories by which we see him. There's some more homework. Go home and think about that for a while. It's called epistemology, just in case you're looking for it on Google. The unforgivable sin is the inability to say or allow to be said the necessary things which advance the kingdom of God. That's pretty much the short hand of what Jesus is saying there. And so everyone, Jesus says, will have to give an account on the day of judgment for every empty word. What we cannot say, when we cannot say the true things, we say foolish things. We say empty things. We say space fillers, which glide over difficult moments like, how are you, bro? Oh, by the way, just had a very difficult day and, my daughter's sick or this, that, the other thing. Excellent. I think that would classify as an empty word. Or, awesome. I'm overcoming, right? At that point, that's a pretty empty word. There might be some other words we could have said in that space. So such words act instead of the thing that should be said. And then we walk away and we said, oh, I should have said that. How many of us have that experience? All the time, right? We always fill the space with the thing which we wished we hadn't said, and then later on we come back and we think, well, I'll write the book about it. That way I'll have time to think and not stick my foot in my mouth. So such words act instead of the thing that should be said. Imagine, for example, you're amongst the disciples when Jesus is walking near Caesarea Philippi, and he turns to his disciples and he says, who do people say the Son of Man is? So there's 10, 11 of them. They're all standing there. They're walking along, and everybody looks at everybody else. Who do people say? Do we tell him that most people think you're a nutcase, Jesus? Do we say to him, you're a wandering, itinerant philosopher, which, by the way, in certain periods during the Roman Empire was illegal because they were seen to be troublemakers, unlicensed by the state? Do we tell them that we think that you might be, it's a bit of a charismatic problem causer? None of them say that. They say, well, some say you're John the Baptist, and some say you're Elijah, others say you're Jeremiah, one of the prophets. Now you think of that for a moment. Is this the point where you jump in and provide the alternative, or you just agree with everybody else? Because all of those things would be pretty respectable things, and for you to be a disciple of any of those people would be a respectable thing. It would be biblical, man. You would be one of the cool dudes if you were Elijah's disciple, or Jeremiah's disciple, or the disciple even of a prophet. But you wouldn't be considered to be, even to yourself, anything worthwhile if you were simply the disciple of a nutcase. So do you jump in and say that? And then Jesus turns to them and he says, but you, who do you say I am? Now that's a critical moment. This is the confession on which Jesus builds his church. What you really say matters, because Jesus knows as a teacher that most people actually don't know what it is they think until they have to do something about it. That's why teachers ask students to answer questions. Because mostly they have no idea what's going on inside their heads until they hear themselves saying it. And most humans are like that. So most of our knowledge is in fact embodied. I can go into that, but not right now. So this brings me to this really difficult point, right? That is, I need to say yes and to some of the things which have been said in the conference. In educational terms, equipping involves knowledge, skills, values, and dispositions. Knowledge, skills, values, dispositions. Say after me. Knowledge, skills, values, dispositions. Knowledge is sort of easy. You can dump it out of a textbook. Well, actually you can't, but anyway. Skills is hard, because most of the people who teach aren't the people who do, and they don't have the skills. Values is really hard, because most people actually don't know what it is they believe until they have to do something about it, and you can't do that in a classroom. Most of the people just nod their heads or repeat what they heard on the radio. And dispositions are invisible and almost untouchable and can only be caught by discipling. So that is a very difficult thing that teachers do, because you need to know that almost all of the things that are valuable in the teaching engagement can't be taught. They can only be formed. So equipping others is what we do to help others along the path. And so you might consider it as a sort of subset of discipling. We should never forget, however, that just as the mission is not our mission, it's his mission. Yes. In the same way, the disciples are not our disciples. Yep. We make disciples for him. Yep. They are his disciples. Yep. And that has a very deep biblical base. It comes down to the tension between the words polis, ecclesia, and kuritate, which is under the lordship of Christ. So there's only one master in the house, in the oikonomia. There's only one master, and the student is never greater than his master. Jesus tells us, even though he may actually do things which are greater than the master, but he's never greater than the master, because you're always in the end the disciple of the master. So historically, movements which say, come to me and I'll make you my disciples, well, those historically speaking, those movements are dead within 2 generations. Right? There's lots of them in the early church. Marcion, anyone heard of Marcion? That didn't last very long. Some of them, of course, were stamped out by Roman soldiers burning their houses down and killing their families, but anyway, that's another thing. So the reason is apparent from our opening reflection. We humans see in part, and the better we get at something, the worse we get at everything. The better we get at something, the worse we get at everything. In fact, I mainly train PhD students these days, which is defined largely as knowing more and more about less and less. That's the process of a PhD. Now, those people are enormously valuable to the church, because there are some apostles, some pastors, some teachers, but very few. And they need to know more and more about less and less. But as Jesus says further down the chapter, do not be afraid of them, for there's nothing concealed which will not be disclosed, or hidden which will not be made known, because people can't help it. If it's in their hearts, it'll come out. History's like that. Humans make all sorts of dumb decisions for what are the best reasons. And we spend most of our lives as historians trying to forgive them. Well, it takes, as I said, a village to raise a child. And there's probably enough here to chew on for about a month, because this is just the précis. If you want to know a little bit about pedagogy and the theory of learning. Well, it takes a village to raise a child. Villages are needed to raise children because they do three things. Actually, they do four things. The fourth one's hidden. It's the box in which the other three things are. Because villages are communities of knowledge. That is, in every large gathering of people, there's going to be someone who knows what's up to date, what's best, what's... Not everybody. More and more about less and less, right? But in a community, there's enough. So communities of knowledge. Villages are also communities of practice. Someone out there is doing something really well, and you can go and model yourself after them and learn the things that can't be taught in the classroom. And then thirdly, villages are communities of formation, where dispositions and values can be taught and formed in people, because largely they can't be enumerated. Here's a list of values. Oh, I've got them now. I understand that. They can only be lived. That's how they get embedded, right? I mean, we were just praying for Pastor Slabbert, and people are saying, well, all the things that you've learnt, all the things that you have had happen to you across your life, some of which have been great and some of which have been terrible, have brought you to the place you are now, and no one could have taught you that when you were 21. And all of us with grey hair say amen. Because we've all had the same similar things happen to us. Villages do those three things. They are communities of knowledge, they are communities of practice, they are communities of formation, and the village itself englobes those communities within an organic, larger learning ecology in which the world of the child can experience all of those three things in a seamless way, which is without tension. And that is the aspiration of the perfect school. Even for those who take control of their child's curriculum, which is knowledge, and frame it within a Christian school or home, which is formation, they can almost never control the place of practice, which is work or creation or endeavour. And it's often at that point where all the efforts of K-12 education come unstuck. The role of the teacher, be that a teacher or a pastor or a homeschooling mum or someone like me who knows a great deal about very little, requires three key ingredients which I'll leave with you. Firstly, the master is the master, and we students are never greater than he, no matter the promise that we shall do greater things than him. Secondly, the singular license required of one who would know much and then teach it is self-knowledge. Before we truly know anything, we need to know where we ourselves stand in the photo frame that we're presenting to others. Thirdly, the inverse of false humility, which typifies most organisations, is true humility. It's the ability to think the thing which you know you couldn't have thought of yourself. He may call us friends, but in the end, we need to remember that the kingdom is made of the children, not of those who are accounted teachers in Israel. What is simple to them becomes harder and harder for those of us who are more accomplished, more mature, more bestowed with titles and temptations to believe our own press. As John the Baptist said poignantly at the end of his life, a person can receive only what is given to them from heaven. You yourselves can testify that I said, I am not the Messiah, but I am set ahead of him. The bride belongs to the bridegroom. The friend who attends the bridegroom waits and listens for him, and is full of joy when he hears the bridegroom's voice. That joy is mine, and now it's complete. He must become greater, and I must become less. That's every teacher's aspiration, if you're a true teacher, which is why there's only some teachers. May the Lord bless you in everything you do. Amen.